Right. Well, we are in the Sonoran Desert, the most biodiverse desert on the planet, the Sonoran Desert. Not just because it's the most studied desert, but for a bunch of other reasons. It's the homeland of the Tohono O'odham people and the Pasquayaki and many other indigenous groups. And as a result, actually, there are lots of place names in our desert named after herps. I work at the Desert Lab on Tuamak Hill, which is a transliteration of Chemamakdoa, Hill of the Horned Lizard. And the Catalina Mountains are also known as Baba Doag or Frog Toad Mountain. This is the west side of Push Peak. The tip of the peak itself is the nose of a giant toad. Baba is the O'odham word for frogs and toads. This is our monthly or quarterly newsletter, the Sonoran Herpetologist, which we are all very proud of. Check it out. All of our issues are free on the website. And if you would like to support our organization, besides just donating and renewing your membership, we have a lot of nice merchandise. Yep, very good. Nice mustard ball cap. So these are companion books to the Snakes of Arizona book. And if you are interested in contributing photographs, observations that will help with these books, you can go to this website, arbooksaz.org. And so myself and next month's speaker, Michael Cardwell, were involved in a special section of this film, which is premiering in Tucson, an early screening. It involves Mojave rattlesnakes. And that's all I will say, but this is a really great film. I was able to see most of it recently, and the film is about the Colorado River and all of the habitats and people that it supports along its way to the Gulf of California. And along the way, we learned about Mojave rattlesnakes. Our partner organization is the State Herp Association of Sonora. They are just formed, I think this year or last year, and they've reached out to us, and we hope to create a great relationship with them and start thinking about a herp meeting in Sonora, where we can all herp in Sonora and learn from each other. So if you're interested in that, let me know. So November's coming up, and that's when we have our board elections. If you're interested in being part of the board, please don't hesitate to contact me. It's a great volunteer thing where you can help decide where our funds go to for grants and how we can be a better part of the conservation community here at Tucson. All of our meetings are recorded and you can watch them on our YouTube channel. Next month, Michael Cardwell will be updating us on how much snakebite treatment has changed in the last decade. He didn't give me a timeline, but it should be very interesting. Michael's a great speaker, and he is kind of seen as the expert on Mojave rattlesnakes. So that'll be fun. Now, I'd like to introduce our speaker for tonight. So originally from the Pacific Northwest, Dr. Javan Bauder earned his MS from Idaho State University, studying the movement ecology of prairie rattlesnakes in central Idaho, before moving to Georgia to study eastern indigo snakes as part of the Orion Society, a nonprofit reptile conservation organization. He earned his PhD from the University of Massachusetts Amherst, studying the population viability and connectivity of eastern indigo snakes in central Florida. Dr. Bauder then worked as a postdoc with the Illinois Natural History Survey and the Pennsylvania Cooperative Fish and Wildlife Research Unit, studying the landscape genetics of white-tailed deer, before joining the USGS Arizona Cooperative Fish and Wildlife Research Unit here at the University of Arizona in 2021. So let's welcome Dr. Bauder.
Thank you, Robert, and thank you all for the opportunity to be here tonight. It's been really exciting to meet a lot of you and speak with you, and look forward to having some more great conversations later this evening. So as the title of my talk suggests, a big theme of my research, or actually two big themes of my research, both prior to coming to Arizona and since joining the co-op unit here at the University of Arizona, is studying individual behaviors and ecological traits. Because I think if we understand how individuals interact with their environments and interact with the landscapes, that gives us a richer amount of information that we can then use to manage and conserve those species at levels of populations or even whole species. And so today I'm going to present three examples from different stages of my research career on the types of questions that I ask when trying to understand those individual level traits and behaviors and trying to use that information towards management and conservation. So the first question I'm going to ask reflects my interest in basic species ecology, because sometimes we need to just understand some pretty elemental aspects of a species ecology before we can think about managing or conserving it. And so I'm going to give an example of how I've studied how a species interacts with its landscape, particularly landscape features that could restrict its movements. Next, I'll provide some examples about how we use this information about individual animals to inform management and conservation of that species. And then the third question reflects the reality, which I'm sure all of us as herpers are very familiar with. Sometimes it's really hard to just find our study species. Our study species may be very cryptic, maybe have very low detection rates. And so sometimes that forces us to think outside the box in how we study our study species. So I'm going to give some examples of my work here in Arizona about how we've made what I think are relatively novel applications of existing technology to better understand a particular species. And in case anyone was wondering, all of my examples are with herps in fitting with this thing. All right, so for the first question that I want to answer, how do individuals respond to potentially restrictive landscape features? We're going to go back in time to my master's research at Idaho State University, where I studied the movement ecology of prairie rattlesnakes in the central Idaho mountains. I worked in the lab of Dr. Chuck Peterson. Some of you may be familiar with his work as a physiological ecologist. Now, what was really nice about my study area was that it was a great area in which to examine how does a snake species respond to a very mountainous landscape. As you can see here, this is a very rugged landscape, and it's smack dab in the middle of the largest contiguous wilderness area in the lower 48 states, the Frank Church River and Overturning Wilderness. And I was working out of the University of Idaho's Taylor Wilderness Research Station. Now, within this study system, the prairie rattlesnakes do overwinter communally, and their hibernacula are typically located along the sides of this major river valley. And when I began this study, my expectation was that these snakes would move in a manner that follows paths of low resistance. So I expected them to primarily move downslope, move along the valley bottoms, along the creek drainages. And next I'm going to show you what some snakes actually did. So I'm going to show some animated movement paths of some of the prairie rattlesnakes that I tracked with radio telemetry. And you can see that this individual in the light blue, this was a male, it did what I expected the snakes to do. It moved down slope and spent the summer moving along the bottom of this river valley. It crossed this river here at the bottom of the valley a few times, and then it moved back uphill back to its same hibernaculum. And within this system, the rattlesnakes do show very high fidelity to their hibernaculum, going back to the same overwintering sites year after year. Now, this individual is another telemetered male. Interestingly, this individual was the only snake in the study that I observed overwintering by itself, so not in a communal hibernaculum. It also moved along the valley bottom, and you may have noticed some very long movements along the river. Those movements occurred during late July and August, which is the mate searching, the breeding season for this population. During that late summer period, the males will move more extensively looking for females. Now, if all of my rattlesnakes had moved this way, I would have had a pretty laid back, easy field season. However, I was quite surprised. For example, this individual was a non-pregnant female. And you can see that instead of moving downslope, she moves uphill. So far uphill that she actually crosses that ridge line and moves into the next river drainage over, where she sort of settles down, spends most of the summer, presumably foraging. And eventually in the late summer, she starts moving back towards her hibernaculum, following almost the exact same route that she used to move away from her hibernaculum in the spring. Now, this non-pregnant female was particularly fun to track because she also moved uphill along the side of this drainage. This snake almost reached 2,000 meters in elevation. Fortunately, she stopped just shy of that, where she, again, kind of settled down, foraged for most of the summer, and then moves back to her hibernaculum, again, following a route that's pretty consistent with what she took in the spring. And so, based on these results and some other analyses that we did, we concluded that topography did have some restrictive effect on the movements of these snakes, but we think it had an effect mostly in imposing some type of upper limit on how far up these snakes would move. Below that upper limit, they really didn't seem to care about topography, moving over ridges, up and down valley bottoms. And so at that finer spatial scale, it really did not seem like topography had a strong restrictive effect on prairie rattlesnake. So now I want to move on to the next question that I'd like to answer tonight. How can we use information about individual level traits and behaviors, particularly their responses to different landscape features, to assist in species management and conservation? And this is going to be the focus for most of my talk, focusing on my work on the eastern indigo snake. This is a species that I've worked on for many years. I still work on it in some capacity with collaborators back east. And I just want to acknowledge the many organizations that allowed me to do this research, particularly the Orion Society, a nonprofit reptile conservation organization. If any of you are familiar with the podcast Snake Talk by Dr. Chris Jenkins, available on Spotify or wherever you get your podcasts, I would highly recommend that podcast. I think there's some really great interviews with snake experts and snake ecologists in a variety of disciplines. So this is the roadmap where I'd like to take us for most of the rest of my talk. I want to start off with an overview of indigo snake life history and their conservation status. I then want to talk about some latitudinal variation in eastern indigo snake ecology, specifically between eastern indigo snakes at the northern edge of their range and the interior of their range. And then I want to close with some examples of what I like to call spatially explicit management products. That's just a fancy term for what are basically maps, but they're maps that convey information about different aspects of indigo snake ecology that we can give to managers or conservation practitioners to help them guide the work that they do. So first, an overview of indigo snake life history and conservation status. So the eastern indigo snake is the longest native snake in North America. They regularly exceed 2.5 meters in length. And they're a very docile snake species to work with. They are endemic to the southeastern United States. And just for future reference, you'll often hear me talk about the northern part of their range during this talk. What I mean by that is the part of their range that occurs in South Georgia or North Florida. And I want to contrast that with the interior of their range within Central Peninsula Florida. Interestingly, this species genus, Drymarchon, is actually a tropical species. So other species of Drymarchon range from South Texas down through Central and South America, as far south as about Argentina. The eastern indigo snake, throughout its range, is surface active year-round. In fact, some of the best time to find eastern indigo snakes is during the winter. And part of this is because, unlike most north temperate snake species, their breeding season occurs primarily during the winter. And during the winter, eastern indigo snake males will move longer distances, actively searching for females, and this species does engage in male-male combat. Now, this is a video that one of my technicians took at our Central Florida study site. These are two male eastern indigo snakes engaged in male-male combat. You can see there that the winner gives the loser one final pin and then faces it off into the underbrush. Now, one of those males was carrying a radio transmitter, which I think is the only reason we were able to get this video. And it turns out that there was a female indigo snake with a radio transmitter just outside the frame. Now, indigo snakes are a dietary generalist. Despite being very docile to handle, they're an absolute terror to the small animals with which they co-occur. Over half of documented prey records are other snake species, and they've been documented eating all 5 sympatric venomous snake species with which they co-occur. But they'll also eat small mammals, baby gopher tortoises and turtles, frogs and toads. There's a prey record of an eastern indigo snake eating a baby alligator. And if anyone was wondering, yes, there is a prey record of an eastern indigo snake eating a juvenile Burmese python in South Florida. Unfortunately, eastern indigo snakes are a federally threatened species, and their imperiled status stems largely from human-induced landscape changes. So loss of habitat, the degradation or fragmentation of their habitat. Historically, overcollection for the pet trade played a large role in their demise. The eastern indigo snake was actually a very popular snake to use on the set of movies because of its large size and docile nature. And then I'll talk a little bit more about this later, but declines in another southeastern species, the gopher tortoise, have also negatively affected eastern indigo snakes. And eastern indigo snakes do have several life history attributes that make them very susceptible to human-induced landscape changes. And these are risk factors that are common to many other large terrestrial species that are threatened or endangered. So eastern indigo snakes have a large body size, makes it easier to get run over on a road. They have very large home range sizes. In fact, some of the largest home range sizes documented for terrestrial snakes, a home range size of an indigo snake in South Georgia exceeded 1,500 hectares. So they really need large tracts of undeveloped land. And then they're an actively foraging species that's surface active year round. Again, makes it more likely that they're going to come into contact with humans. And indeed, indigo snakes in more developed landscapes or landscapes with more roads do have lower survival rates. So this graph shows some results from a study that was conducted several years ago by some colleagues of mine down in Florida. The y-axis of this graph shows annual survival rate. And down here along the x-axis, this represents a gradient of increasing urban development or road density. So as road density or urban development increases on a landscape, indigo snake survival also decreases. All right, so now I'm going to transition and talk a little bit more about some latitudinal or geographic variation in indigo snake ecology, specifically some differences in indigo snake ecology between the northern part of their range in South Georgia and the interior of their range in peninsular Florida. Now, at the northern edge of their range, eastern indigo snakes are very closely associated with the longleaf pine ecosystem. The historical distribution of the longleaf pine ecosystem is shown in this map on the upper right-hand corner. Historically, it ranged across the southeastern coastal plain, and it was a very fire-dependent ecosystem. So it relied on low-intensity fires occurring about once every 1 to 5 years. And that's what allows it to maintain this very open savanna-like structure with low canopy cover, low tree density, and a very lush and diverse ground cover of grasses and forbs. Unfortunately, the longleaf pine ecosystem itself is an imperiled ecosystem. Only about 5% of the longleaf pine ecosystem remains intact. Again, largely because land uses have changed, but also because of widespread fire suppression. And these declines have negatively affected another southeastern species, the gopher tortoise. Now, within their range, gopher tortoises are considered an ecosystem engineer because of the burrows that these guys dig. Now, gopher tortoises will dig these very long, deep burrows. They can be 20 to 30 feet long, 6 to 8 feet deep underground. And they dig these burrows primarily on patches of loose, sandy, well-drained soil called sandhills. And you'll hear me come back to sandhills a little later on at the top. Now, over 200 species of vertebrate and invertebrate animals have been documented using these burrows, including these guys, eastern diamondback rattlesnakes, which are always fun to run into when you're out looking for indigo snakes. But yes, eastern indigo snakes themselves do use gopher tortoise burrows. And in fact, in the northern part of their range, eastern indigo snakes are actually dependent upon gopher tortoises specifically for overwintering sites. And I'll show this in the results of a few studies here. So this graph shows the proportion of below ground observations of radiotelemetered indigo snakes in different types of underground shelter sites. So we have gopher tortoise burrows, root holes or stump holes, windrows, armadillo burrows. And those different colored bars represent the proportions in different seasons. And what I want to draw your attention to is that, well, first off, indigo snakes primarily use gopher tortoise burrows throughout the year. But most importantly, during the fall and especially the winter, indigo snakes are using gopher tortoise burrows 80 to 90% of their time. Now, a study that I did looking at the likelihood of indigo snakes occurring on sandhills, so those patches of dry, sandy, well-drained soil. The probability of indigo snakes occurring on a sandhill during the winter was positively related to the number of gopher tortoise burrows on that sandhill. So the more tortoise burrows a sandhill has, the more likely indigo snakes are going to use that sandhill during the winter. And finally, radiotelemetry studies on indigo snakes in South Georgia have indeed found that during the winter, these snakes are almost exclusively residing on sandhills that contain gopher tortoise burrows. Now, we think the reason behind this very close association between indigo snakes and gopher tortoise burrows largely stems from temperature, since we are talking about ectotherms. And so to dive more deeply into this, I recorded temperatures in several locations across the environment for a few weeks, one winter in southern Georgia. And I'm going to show those results in this graph. That y-axis is going to represent temperature. The x-axis is going to represent time of day. So I'm going to show average temperatures for each hour in a 24-hour period. And then that horizontal black line represents freezing. So here are the temperatures that I recorded in those different environmental conditions. Now that light gray line is the air temperature, and you can see that it regularly got at or below freezing. That dark gray line is the maximum operative temperature, and this is basically the maximum temperature that an indigo snake could experience out on the surface, so not in some kind of burrow. Those colored dashed lines represent the temperatures within a gopher tortoise burrow at different distances from the burrow entrance. And what I want to draw your attention to is this blue line. That's the temperature at the back of a gopher tortoise burrow. So for most of the day, the warmest place in the environment that an indigo snake could find is the back of a gopher tortoise burrow. Now this figure shows some actual indigo snake movement data that I collected using radio telemetry at a study site in South Georgia. Those sand hills that I mentioned are represented by these kind of convoluted light yellow polygons. And then the colored dots and lines represent the actual movements of eastern indigo snake. Now these two individuals over the right were a couple of females. Once things warmed up in the spring, they did move off of the sandhill into some of the surrounding landscape, but they would come back onto the sandhill during the summer and kind of shuttle on and off the sandhill throughout the summer and fall. These other three individuals are males, and they moved in a different way. They would leave the sandhill during the spring, but they moved off of the sandhill and stayed off of the sandhill for the rest of the summer. In fact, they made what I would describe as seasonal migration movements, migrating away from a sandhill towards some surrounding habitat type. Other radio telemetry studies in South Georgia found a similar pattern, that males migrate off of sandhills towards some surrounding habitat and then will come back to the sandhill during the winter. And in fact, long-term mark recapture studies have found that indigo snakes regularly come back to the same sandhill year after winter, and in some cases, we can find the same snake around the same tortoise burrow from winter to winter. During the summer, when these indigo snakes are off of the sandhill, they're using a much greater diversity of habitat types, often more mesic or wetter habitats, the edges of wetlands, floodplain forests. Now, I mentioned these indigo snakes often moving in a manner that resembles seasonal migrations. What struck me most about this is that many other snake species in north temperate environments also make seasonal migrations. So there's many great documented examples of snakes in north temperate environments overwintering in communal hibernacula and then undertaking long distance migrations up to 20 kilometers for prairie rattlesnakes in southern Canada. And then these snakes will migrate back to the overwintering sites in the fall. And so even though we might not think of South Georgia as having very cold winters, I think it's remarkable that we do have a species that even in the relatively mild winters of South Georgia exhibits these types of seasonal migrations. All right, so we've touched on a lot of examples of the behavior and ecology of individuals. How can we use this information to guide management and conservation of the species? I want to touch on two examples. The first is the role of prescribed fire. So we know that the longleaf pine ecosystem is a fire-dependent ecosystem. It relies on these frequent low-intensity burns to maintain an open canopy structure and a very diverse ground cover that species like gopher tortoises really depend on. And so prescribed fire should and indeed does play an important role in habitat and wildlife management in the Southeast, not just for eastern indigo snakes and gopher tortoises, but for many other species in the Southeast. Now, second, because we know that eastern indigo snakes at the northern edge of their range often undertake these seasonal migrations away from their wintering habitat, we can use this information to help guide landscape level management and planning. So just as a hypothetical example, let's say that we have a sandhill that's occupied by indigo snakes during the winter. And then we have some sandhills elsewhere in the landscape. And we might want to understand how well connected are these different sandhills. Well, if we know how far indigo snakes move during these seasonal migrations, we can buffer this sandhill that we know has indigo snakes and determine what other sandhills on the landscape fall within this buffer. And that could help us prioritize which sandhills do we want to manage or restore, how might we want to maintain or promote connectivity or the ability of indigo snakes to move amongst these different sandhills. All right, so I've been talking a lot about eastern indigo snakes in southern Georgia. But you'll notice from this range map that indigo snakes occur in many other places besides southern Georgia, specifically throughout peninsular Florida. And so, does eastern indigo snake ecology in peninsular Florida differ from that of eastern indigo snake ecology in South Georgia? And spoiler alert, there are some pretty noticeable differences. And I think this is remarkable considering the fact that there's only a few hundred kilometers between South Georgia and Central Florida, and yet we see some very marked differences in indigo snake movement and behavior. Again, I think these differences largely come down to temperature. So as a reminder, here is the graph that I showed you earlier showing different temperature readings during the winter in South Georgia. And I pointed out that the warmest place that an indigo snake can occur is at the back of a gopher tortoise burrow. Now, here are some similar environmental temperature readings for that same winter, that same time period at our study site in Central Florida. Now, the y-axes are a little bit different. The scales are a little bit different, so bear with me on that. But look at where this light gray line representing air temperature is in Florida compared to southern Georgia. Much higher. The operative temperature, that is the temperature that an indigo snake could experience out on the surface, is much higher in Florida than it is in Georgia. And most important, I think, notice the difference between the temperature at the back of a tortoise burrow and the operative temperature on the surface. In South Georgia, you're about 13 degrees warmer during the night if you're at the back of a tortoise burrow. You're only about 4 degrees warmer at the back of a tortoise burrow in Central Florida. And I think this allows indigo snakes to be much more flexible in their movements and their habitat use and their behavior in Florida. And we see this if we look at how frequently indigo snakes are using gopher tortoise burrows in Georgia compared to Florida. So this graph shows the proportion of observations, again from radio-telemetered indigo snakes, within tortoise burrows for 4 seasons in Georgia and in Florida. And notice that during the fall and the winter, indigo snakes are indeed found primarily in gopher tortoise burrows. But in Florida, you find them in gopher tortoise burrows about half the time throughout the entire year. And indeed, some of our indigo snakes at our Central Florida study sites, we never saw them use a gopher tortoise burrow during the winter. They were using other forms of underground retreat sites. We see differences in home range size. So this graph shows annual home range size for male and female indigo snakes, again in Georgia and Florida. Both males and females have larger home range sizes in Georgia compared to Florida. But notice how striking that difference is for the males. Males in Georgia have much, much larger home range sizes than they do in Florida. And we think that this largely reflects the fact that in Florida, we don't see those seasonal migrations. Indigo snakes will be moving around the same areas during the winter as they will be during the summer. We don't see that separate habitat use like we do in southern Georgia. And then finally, within peninsular Florida, indigo snakes just use a much greater diversity of habitats. They're found in virtually every natural vegetation community in peninsular Florida. On the very southern edge of Florida, you can even find indigo snakes using the edges of mangrove swamps. And then indigo snakes will also use a wide variety of human disturbed or human modified habitats. You can find them on the banks of canals going through abandoned citrus groves or even active sugarcane fields. You can find them in the citrus groves themselves. We find them in cattle pastures. And we find them in a range of rural and even urban developments. Now, these observations don't mean that these habitats are good habitats for indigo snakes or that they could support viable populations, but it does illustrate the plasticity or the variety of habitats that these snakes can use. So, having demonstrated that there are indeed some differences in ecology between indigo snakes at the northern edge of their range and the interior edge of their range, I want to transition to what was really the focus of my PhD work at the University of Massachusetts. And that is using this information about how individual indigo snakes move and interact with their landscape to develop management products that can be helped used in their management and conservation. And the first example that I'm going to talk about is some work looking at the habitat selection of individual indigo snakes. And when I say habitat selection, that just means that we're looking at what habitats are indigo snakes using relative to what's available for them to use. Are they using something more frequently than we would expect? Or are they avoiding a certain habitat more than we would expect? This map just shows the location of the data that we used, or that I used for my dissertation. That red star is the Central Florida study site where I worked at. And then I had some great collaborators from the Kennedy Space Center that contributed a very large radio telemetry data set to use as well. All right, so looking at habitat selection of individuals. We looked at habitat selection at two levels. And the first level is just asking, how do indigo snakes select their home ranges from across the landscape? So where do they position themselves in the landscape? But then also, how do they select specific locations within their home range? We use some statistical analyses to look at selection for a wide variety of habitat features. But the take-home results were that indigo snakes were consistently selecting large expanses of undeveloped upland habitat. And this makes sense given their large home range sizes. They also selected areas that had a lot of habitat heterogeneity or variety of habitats. And then, even though we did find them using urbanized areas, they tended to avoid those areas or use those areas less than we would expect. So if someone were to ask me, what do you think good indigo snake habitat in Florida looks like? I would probably show you a picture something like this. This is a landscape that has a mosaic of seasonal depressional wetlands. This is during the dry season, so that dry dead grass there in the middle is actually the seasonal wetland. But it's surrounded by a lot of upland habitat. And this provides indigo snakes with a large diversity of habitat types within a relatively small area, gives them more opportunities for foraging on different prey species, different shelter sites, again, all within a relatively small area. Now, because we used the particular type of statistical analyses that we used, we were able to convert the habitat selection results into maps that actually show in space where are indigo snakes most likely to select. And so in both of these maps, the green areas represent areas that indigo snakes are more likely to select based on our two levels of analysis. But we can also combine those two maps to create a single map that integrates that information about selection at those two different levels. So this could be useful to, say, land managers who want to know where on the landscape should I try to conserve or protect the habitat, or how connected or isolated are areas where indigo snakes are more likely to select. Maybe we want to try to promote or enhance connectivity. Now, these results were all well and good, but they apply only to one study area within Central Florida. When we talked with our collaborators at the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, again, this being a federally threatened species, they were interested in having information about indigo snake habitat suitability and connectivity across the range of the eastern indigo snake. And so this leads me to my next example. And this is a series of projects that I worked on with Dr. Houston Chandler from the Orion Society. He's their director of science. A lot of this forms his PhD work at Virginia Tech. And our ultimate goal was to develop a range-wide connectivity model for eastern indigo snakes. But there were two components that we had to address first. First, we needed that range-wide habitat suitability model. And second, we wanted to use this connectivity model to identify what I like to call conservation units. And those are just patches of habitat that are connected for eastern indigo snakes. But if you recall from earlier in my talk, we know that there are differences in the habitat associations between eastern indigo snakes at the northern and interior parts of their range. Specifically at the northern edge of their range, indigo snakes are very closely associated with sandhills containing gopher tortoise burrows. Whereas in the interior part of their range, they use a much wider diversity of habitats. So how can we incorporate this information when developing a single range-wide habitat. Well, first we assembled a bunch of different features that represent different aspects of indigo snake habitat: land cover, soil moisture, fire frequency. And then we took the mean winter temperature across the range of the eastern indigo snake. And we did this because we thought this probably captures that gradient of indigo snakes being more closely associated with gopher tortoise burrows at the northern edge of their range, becoming less closely associated as you move south. And then we allowed all of these different habitat variables to vary interactively with winter temperature. And this just means that we allowed the relationship between habitat suitability and that covariate to be different depending on the temperature. So in this graph, that dark purple line is the relationship between habitat selection and soil drainage at a very cold winter, areas with very cold winters, that is southern Georgia. And that positive or increasing relationship means that indigo snakes are more closely associated with sandy, well-drained soils. Again, sandhills. Now, this yellow line represents that association where winters are very mild. So think South Florida. So in South Florida, you can see there's virtually no relationship between soil drainage and habitat suitability. Again, because indigo snakes are using a much greater diversity of habitats. Put all this together, run some analyses, and we get this map showing habitat selection for eastern indigo snakes across their range. And now we wanted to identify these conservation units or patches, the habitat patches that are connected for eastern indigo snakes. I'm going to go through the technical details rather quickly, but I'm more than happy to talk about them later. Basically, we took our habitat model, converted that to a surface that we call a resistant surface. So this reflects how easy or how difficult it is for an indigo snake to move through the landscape. We used a technique called resistance kernels to develop this connectivity surface over here on the right. And this shows how well connected the landscape is for individual indigo snakes. We can then take this continuous surface and slice it into discrete patches to get something that looks like this. So these bright green polygons here represent suitable habitat patches for indigo snakes. And then the multicolored polygons around those bright green patches represent those conservation units. But within each of these multicolored patches, those suitable habitat patches are connected for eastern indigo snakes. So the last example that I want to talk about goes into the answers the question of, are these conservation units, these patches that we've just delineated, capable of supporting viable populations over many years? Now, we know that population viability in eastern indigo snakes is largely driven by adult survival. Where adult survival is low, a population is more likely to go extinct. Where adult survival is high, the population is more likely to persist into the future. We also know that the primary landscape feature that influences adult survival is urban development and road density. Where there's more roads and more urban development, indigo snake adult survival goes down. So we wanted to use this information to ask how many of these conservation units are capable of supporting viable populations of eastern indigo snakes. To do this, we first needed to model the relationship between survival and road density. And that's shown in this graph here, where, as you might expect, the more roads there are in the landscape, the lower the survival rate. But now that we have this relationship statistically modeled, we can use the model that produced this relationship to make predictions. So we can take a map of road density, plug that into our model, and it spits out a map of indigo snake survival. And just as an example, here is such a map from my study site in Central Florida. The darker areas are areas of lower survival. And as you might guess from this map, these kind of black blobs right here are areas where there's a lot of roads. And you can see the darker color, lower survival, in those areas with higher road densities. So my colleague Houston Chandler took this information and picked 4 different road density values that spanned the range of road density values across our study area. So low, medium, high, very high. He used a technique called integral projection models. Again, if anyone's interested in what that is, happy to talk later. But in essence, we were able to take this predicted relationship between survival and road density, plug it into the model for each of these 4 different road density values, and estimate the population viability. Now the outputs look something like this, and I'll walk us through this graph. The parameter that we're most interested in here is a parameter called lambda, or population growth rate. If lambda is greater than 1, it means the population is growing. If lambda is less than 1, it means the population is declining. And these different curves here show the distribution of lambda values for each of those 4 different road density values. So if we look over on the right, we see that the low and median road density values have distributions that are predominantly above 1. So at those road density values, indigo snake populations are probably okay. This high road density value or distribution kind of splits 50-50 between greater than 1, less than 1. So the population may be stable, may be declining. What's most concerning is when we get to the very high road density values. You can see that this curve is almost entirely less than 1, indicating strong likelihood of declining populations at very high road density values. But using this modeling structure, again, we can go to any one of these conservation units, calculate its road density, run it through this model, and get an estimate on how likely that indigo snake population is to persist into the future. All right, starting to wrap things up, the last question that I want to address here is essentially, what do we do if our study species is really hard to study? How can we use the different technological resources that are available in new and creative ways to help better study our species? And so I'm going to talk about some of the work that has gone on in my lab here in Arizona. This is some of our research on narrow-headed garter snakes, and it was led by a former master's student of mine, Travis Roderick, who successfully defended his thesis this January. Now, Travis's project primarily was focused on studying the population ecology of narrow-headed garter snakes. He actually had a really unique opportunity to also study narrow-headed garter snakes that were raised at the Phoenix Zoo and then released at his study site during his study. But I'm going to talk about some of the techniques that we used. So to give a little background, his study site was Canyon Creek up in the Payson area. And it's shown on this map of the distribution of narrow-headed garter snakes. Narrow-headed garter snakes are another federally threatened species, so they've declined throughout their range, presumably due to some combination of loss of aquatic habitats, altered flow regimes, invasive aquatic species. And we established about a 1.7 kilometer survey reach along Canyon Creek, within which we looked for narrow-headed garter snakes. Not just narrow-headed garter snakes, but this is a really unique study site in that there's actually 3 species of garter snake present at this site. Narrow-headed garter snakes, the more abundant western terrestrial garter snakes, and then we actually get a few blackneck garter snakes in there as well. And we look for our garter snakes the quote-unquote old-fashioned way. So we conduct visual encounter surveys by walking along the stream, turning movable rocks and logs. We also used wire minnow traps that we baited with dead rainbow trout from the nearby fish hatchery. When we caught a snake, we measure it, weigh it, sex it, and then mark it with a pit tag. And a pit tag is basically a microchip, same technology as you use to get your dog or cat microchipped. And this allows us to uniquely identify individuals that we recaptured. And we did catch quite a few garter snakes. This table here just shows some summaries of our captures. And these were a lot more captures than we expected. But I also want to say it took a lot of work to get these captures. We had very long field days, long field sessions, and we would have liked to have gotten more recaptures of those pit tags. So this led us to try some other techniques to try to get more recaptures of pit tag Gartersnakes. And the first technique is something that we call pit tag telemetry. Now this is not a metal detector. That little gray disc on the bottom of that pole is actually an antenna that reads the barcodes of those pit tags. And you use this antenna the exact same way you would use a metal detector, just walking along the stream bank scanning. And when you scan a pit tag, the pit tag reader makes a little beep and records that unique barcode. Believe it or not, this technique actually works. We were kind of skeptical going into it, but we've spent a little over 11 hours over 7 days during 2023 and most recently this summer, 2025. And we've made 12 detections of pit tag Gartersnakes. That doesn't seem like a lot, but when you consider that that's just 11 hours of casually walking along the stream bank as opposed to turning over rocks and logs, we consider this technique to be pretty successful, and looking forward to continuing to use it. We get these detections in a variety of different environments. So this photo on the left is detections that we got just on the base of the shrub. That photo in the kind of center right was a detection that we got in the middle of this grassy patch. The snake was underground and moved, so we know that it was a real snake, but we didn't find a hole, a burrow. We have no idea where the snake exactly was underground. So these are detections that we never would have gotten with typical visual encounter surveys or trapping. Breaking this down, most of these detections were Western terrestrial Gartersnakes. And what was really exciting to us was that 7 of these detections were snakes that we marked back in 2023. So we know that these snakes have at least survived 2 winters since we first marked them. Now, the second technique that we used were passive pit tag arrays. This is technology that the fisheries field uses very extensively. That black cable right there is a pit tag antenna. So if a garter snake carrying a pit tag crawls over or along that antenna, this reader inside this yellow pelican case here will record that pit tag and store it. And these antennas will can be scanning 24/7. So you can have continuous monitoring of your study area. They're powered by a 12-volt battery that lasts about 4 weeks with the settings that we used. Just to give you a little perspective, this is a 25-foot loop cable, and in this case, we run it just parallel to the stream bank, about 1 meter or 2 from the edge of the stream. Now, we deployed 4 of these arrays throughout our survey reach. This is a photo of Travis downloading the data, and that little screenshot there on the bottom just shows the type of data that you record with these devices. So during 2024, when we first put out these pit tag arrays, again, we had no idea if this was going to work. This was just kind of, let's give it a shot and see what happens. And we were very pleasantly surprised to see how many individuals we detected. The total contacts is just a single instance of an individual getting detected on the pit tag. In some cases, we would get 15 to 20 minutes worth of pit tag readings from the same individual. So I don't know if the snake crawled on the antenna and just sat there, or snuggled up along the side of the antenna and sat there, but it was clearly being read by the antenna for quite a long period. And then as far as unique individuals, 10 narrow-headed garter snakes, 7 Western terrestrial garter snakes. Again, many of these are observations that we never would have made using that traditional trapping or survey. So we'll be hopefully continuing to deploy these pit tag arrays at our study site in Canyon Creek to continue monitoring the garter snakes there. And altogether, these techniques give us some information on movement data, so we did not have to use radio telemetry. These graphs just show the distribution of distances between consecutive recaptures. Most of our garter snakes are only moving about 100 to 200 meters between recaptures. But you can see that for both species, we get some rather long movements between those recaptures, over 800 meters for one Western terrestrial garter snake. All right, so to wrap it up and bring it home, I've covered 3 different questions today relating to how we can study individual level traits and behaviors and use that information to help guide species management. We looked at an example of studying how potentially restricted landscape features may influence individual movements. With eastern indigo snakes, we provided some examples for how we can use information about individuals to provide products that are useful for management and conservation purposes. And then finally, sometimes we have to think outside the box when we're studying our secretive, hard to find study species. And in some cases, the novel applications of existing technology can benefit our work with those species. With that, thank you again very much for the chance to be the speaker. It's been great to be here, and again, looking forward to hopefully talking more with all of you later this evening. This is my email address. Please feel free to reach out to me if you have any questions about the work that I've done or the work going on in my lab. So thank you very much.
What's the snake he's choking down on the bottom there?
Excellent question. So this is a gray rat snake that was about 4 feet, and that indigo snake was about 5 feet. I actually don't know if the snake got the rat snake down. And this is a coach whip. One of my technicians in Florida took this photo. And according to my technician who took the photo of the indigo snake in the orange tree, there was a mouse in the orange tree. Presumably that's why the indigo snake's climbing the tree.
So am I understanding correctly that indigo snakes utilize gopher tortoise burrows more towards the north of their range?
Yes. Indigo snakes in the southern part of their range will use tortoise burrows, but not as frequently, and that use does not appear to be a dependence. So in the more mild winters of South Florida, to some extent, any hole in the ground works for an overwintering site. And I think that's why we see that much greater diversity
So
in shelter use.
This helps them in the winter.
Yep.
Further north. Okay.
Yep.
And then I was also curious about habitat complexity and vegetation in the north, and how that might be a factor in sort of helping them get through the winter.
Yeah, no, that's a good question. As far as we know, it appears that the gopher tortoise burrows are really the key for indigo snakes getting through winters in South Georgia and Florida. There's really no other place in the environment that can get that warm. Now, during the summer, we sometimes find indigo snakes on sandhills, but much less frequently during the winter. And this is my untested hypothesis, but I wonder if temperature again plays a role there, because a sandhill, being a more open environment, gets a lot hotter during the hot Georgia summers, whereas some of these more mesic habitats that the indigo snakes are using more frequently during the summers, a lot more shade, probably easier for them to thermoregulate or maybe even just thermoconform to the environment. I may have temperature data that could be used to test that hypothesis, but I haven't looked at it.
It's really interesting because, I think of course we get indigo snakes in southern Sonora, and in terms of tropical species reaching their northern limits, it seems to be very different factors. Like in our side of the continent, it's canyons, deep canyons, and habitat complexity that are these cold buffers for cold winter temperatures that help these creatures exist further north.
Right.
So I guess in this case, it's the burrows being able to go underground.
Yep. Yeah, that's a great point. I do think of the eastern indigo snakes as a tropical species that kind of got stuck in the southeastern coastal plain, and they have to kind of make the best of their situation, and the gopher tortoise burrows allow them to do that.
Have you seen really cold winters push the population south because they're, we see that even with javelinas, where they'll go north in like New Mexico, they'll get into some pretty temperate areas, and one cold winter will just literally push them south.
Yeah, that's a good question. I don't think we've seen range contractions, but what we have seen, so the winter that I collected the data that I showed, for better or for worse, happened to be one of the coldest, wettest winters on record. And that year we found, I don't remember the number, it may have only been like in the neighborhood of 3 or 4 indigo snakes in a very diseased or emaciated status during the winter, and that's very unusual. We think that the cold, wet winter probably had something to do with it. They may have been able to hang on. Well, they were able to hang on as a population, but on an individual level, it looked like some of them did not handle that more extreme winter well. Great question.
So many East Coast species are kind of suffering from this snake fungal disease. The indigo snake subjected to that, and does that enter your algorithm at all?
Yeah, so indigo snakes have tested positive for snake fungal disease. In South Georgia, they develop this, have this condition that they'll develop during the winter, where we'll often find them with a lot of lesions on the bottom, on their underside, only during the winter. Once they have a shed or two in the spring, their skin clears up, they look beautiful. And vets that we've talked to about that think that that's a function of during the winter, they're spending a lot of time in these damp, relatively cool. The tortoise burrows may be the warmest place on the environment, but they're still relatively cool. And that provides a better environment for bacteria and fungi to grow on the snakes. And those really diseased and emaciated snakes that I was mentioning had very extreme cases of those lesions during that very cold, wet winter. To some extent, we think that's a natural process, but with snake fungal disease, that could kind of throw another wrench into it. Yeah, so there are folks actively monitoring indigo snake disease for that reason.
What is collaborative conservation looking like between eastern indigo snakes and the gopher tortoise? Because clearly, like in the northern range, the gopher tortoise benefits the eastern indigo snake, but I know you mentioned that the young can get preyed upon by eastern indigo snakes. Is there any mutualistic benefit between the two?
Yeah, so that's a great question. As far as the collaborative conservation, indigo snake conservation and gopher tortoise conservation pretty much go hand in hand. And that also goes hand in hand with longleaf pine restoration. So a lot of the NGOs that like the Nature Conservancy, Longleaf Alliance, that are really focused on the habitat side of things, if they're restoring longleaf pine habitat, they're going to be benefiting gopher tortoises and eastern. As far as mutualistic relationships between those two species, the gopher tortoises definitely benefit the indigo snakes. I'm not sure that gopher tortoises get any benefit from indigo snakes, and indeed, indigo snakes will eat baby gopher tortoises. I'm unaware of any evidence suggesting that indigo snakes can have a negative population level effect on gopher tortoises. Yeah, that predation definitely does happen.
And I wouldn't be surprised if the snake dug up tortoise eggs. Do they dig things up?
Good question. As far as we know, indigo snakes are not associated with active digging themselves. But gopher tortoises typically often will lay their eggs on the aprons of those burrows, which is a great basking place for indigo snakes. So yeah, it's a convenient meal for sure. Roy, thanks for your question on Zoom about connectivity. Let me read the question just so I can answer it. Okay. Yeah, that's a great question about translocation. To my knowledge, we and our colleagues down in the Southeast have not taken the results of our connectivity and population viability analysis and used it in a systematic way to guide reintroduction or translocation efforts for eastern indigo snakes. To date, there have been some indigo snake reintroductions to the Florida Panhandle, which is an area that they historically occurred, but as far as we know, indigo snakes have been extirpated from the Florida Panhandle. And so there's been some translocation work there. Yeah, as far as I know, our results haven't been used in that type of effort. Brian Sullivan asked, could indigo snakes play a role in reducing activity of egg-eating predators near tortoise nest sites? That's a really good question. I'm not sure. If the egg-eating predators are small enough for indigo snakes to eat, I could see that happening, given indigo snakes' diverse diet. But yeah, I'm not sure. That's a really good question. I think that's everything.
Thank you very much. That's great.
Thank you.
So one last question, we talk about taking the individual to the community. And there's this whole concept on this personality, animals have personality. So how do we get around it? I mean, the only way to do that, every time you add another animal, you're adding some new dimension of that species or that population. It just means you have greater numbers of animals in your experimental sample size. How do you do it?
That's a really good question. Any prospective PhD students in the crowd want to? Next. Yeah, no, that's a good question. Unfortunately, it's kind of out of my wheelhouse. I haven't delved into thinking of what we call personalities, but I totally agree that that's something that could affect the dynamics of your population, especially if you're moving individuals around and you happen to move the biggest, baddest snake in the neighborhood into a new area, or you're moving very kind of timid, shy individuals that are less likely to move into new areas, and maybe they don't disperse and kind of recolonize like you hope they might. I don't know, but definitely something to. Questions? Robert, you can tell me when to shut it down if you need to.
That is good. Thanks.
Well, thank you all, and I'm happy to stick around afterwards as long as folks would like.
Or have
Information.